and welcome back to Mobility Revolution. We're your hosts, Nate Ryan,
I'm Reese Moulton.
and we have a special guest with us today, Harry Campbell, the Rideshare Guy. He's probably one of my favorite thought leaders in the rideshare space, and it's awesome to have you on the show today, Harry.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here and excited to chat. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
Thanks for joining us, Harry.
So to jump right into it, obviously this is going to be a big topic of conversation today is how is the coronavirus pandemic changing the gig economy and how are workers adapting to it right now?
Yeah, well, I think the most obvious thing we've seen is that there's been a huge drop off in demand for Uber and Lyft drivers. And so I think that, like a lot of sectors of the economy right now, rideshare is hurting. And, I don't think there's too many people arguing that. I think even the companies themselves have come out with numbers that have sort of showed the decline in trips. And I think also just when you think about it, right, the CDC number one recommendation right now is social distancing, stay 6 feet away from other people. And when you get into the back of someone's car, you immediately break that rule. So I don't think it takes a doctor or a rocket scientist to realize that, not only is demand kind of down, but it's also, a bit unsafe, I would say, to be driving right now. So, I think kudos to the drivers that are still out there, doing it. And, because I think they may still be providing, essential rides for people that need to get to hospitals or grocery stores or food places or whatever it is, so that's one of the silver linings of positives. But I think that the reality is that it is tough out there right now for a lot of Uber and Lyft drivers, and they do have to look to other, sources of relief.
Mm-hmm. And, before we go into, we want to talk about some of those other sources like delivery and whatnot. But are there any resources that Uber and Lyft are providing drivers that are being affected by this, drastic drop in frequency of rides and things like that?
Yeah, so I think that Uber and Lyft were a bit slow, or very slow, to be frank, to react to the whole coronavirus. And I think especially in respect to their drivers, in mid-March, they started telling their employees to work from home, but they really hadn't started sending out much guidance or really kind of gone above and beyond the bare minimum as far as, offerings to drivers, whether it was the sick pay or, trying to pass out, hand sanitizer, or even just kind of basic communication, which, as you and I know, is somewhat free, right? It doesn't cost money to just keep drivers updated and informed. So I think that they sort of struggled with that at first, but now the companies are sort of shifting into full gear and doing a much better job. Lyft sent out an email last week that sort of had all the resources and information. They even partnered with Amazon to, sort of give another option to drivers. It's as far as delivery or work in a warehouse or, just sort of kind of empathizing more with drivers. Uber today actually just launched a new site called Uber Work that kind of connects drivers with other work opportunities. So it does seem like the companies are now shifting into high gear and realizing like kind of, oh crap, our drivers aren't making any money. They don't have anything to do. We need to, kind of go above and beyond to not only, work with the government, but just find other companies that are seeing positive, sort of hiring trends. Because I think that's the thing to keep in mind too, that even though right now a lot of industries are hurting, I think in every downturn, there are businesses that see booms. And so it's sort of have to identify those opportunities, and Uber and Lyft can throw around their weight to, get drivers in on some of those opportunities and to the front of the line.
Right.
Yep.
And, I actually just recently watched that live cast you did. I think it was on April Fool's Day.
Oh, was it?
And yeah, and a lot of the questions coming through that I saw on the live feed were questions around the like unemployment services. Is Uber and Lyft doing anything for me if I do get sick? Are they, you were just saying they're slow to react, but have they put out anything for potential sick pay or anything like that?
Yeah, so fortunately, I think all of the companies, so Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, all the sort of top gig companies in both rideshare and food delivery right now, they do have a form of sick pay for drivers who have been diagnosed with coronavirus or if they've been ordered to self-quarantine by a doctor or a public health official. So to me, I think that's kind of, again, I mean, I think that's definitely a good thing, but it is the bare minimum in that, obviously, if you're sick with coronavirus, not only should you not be driving, for your own sake. But I think Uber and Lyft and these companies don't want you out there on the road either. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of obviously benefits everyone, and so that's what they've done with sick pay. But there are a lot of drivers who aren't sick, who maybe aren't able to get access to testing, and so I think that's sort of that next step, that next level where drivers are asking for more. What if I'm feeling symptoms? What if I was exposed? What if I don't have health insurance, and can't see a doctor? I think a lot of those questions still aren't being addressed. But I think one thing that has been addressed relatively is the unemployment insurance side of things. And, like you echoed, that's the number one question that we're hearing from drivers right now. And I think that's for a couple reasons. It's because it's going to be the largest potential contribution for a lot of drivers. And so luckily, as part of the CARES Act, drivers were included in this unemployment. So traditionally, gig workers can't file for unemployment, and now they will be able to. And not only that, they're able to get an extra $600 a week on top of whatever they qualify for in their state. So, what a reason why this is so challenging and why we're getting so many questions is because it's a state by state issue. So you actually have to go to your local state's unemployment website and file there. And as you might imagine, every 50 states has a different application process and asks different questions. And the one positive though is drivers haven't started, I guess positive and negative, drivers haven't actually started receiving this money yet. It's still kind of being filtered through the federal government, and so you're not missing out on anything yet as a driver. But we are sort of recommending to drivers that they get on that right now and kind of try to go through the application process as best as they can, so when the money is available, they will have access to that unemployment.
Nice. And real quick before Reese kind of hits the delivery side of what drivers are doing, I want to just let everybody know that's listening, check with your city. I know at least in Los Angeles, they're creating what's called the LA Jobs Portal, that has a lot of retailers who have available jobs out there. So go check with your cities to see if they're creating these job portals. That way, you can see what's out there if you're really being affected by this.
Yep. So, with the recent ride request decline for Uber and Lyft drivers, obviously a lot of drivers are moving over to food and grocery delivery. So what kind of advice do you have for first timers, doing these or signing up with these delivery services? And have you noticed that some services are clearly a better option than others right now for drivers?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we're seeing a shift into food delivery right now for obvious reasons, the decreased demand with rideshare, but also just the fact that, I think 90% of the US is sheltering in place right now. And so a lot of people, are ordering more food and ordering more groceries. So I think that kind of makes sense. The thing I will say though, is that Instacart to me has really been the only service we've been hearing from couriers, and Instacart is really the only one where some are reporting that business is booming. And sort of, that Instacart couriers are saying, oh, I'm making very good money. I'm making more than I've ever made. And, I won't say that's a blanket statement because, as we've seen in the gig economy, experience can really vary depending on the city you're working in, the times you're driving, and even how good of a driver you are. That's really what my whole site and what my whole business is predicated on. And, when we've surveyed drivers, the ones with more experience actually make more money per hour than the ones who are brand new. So there are a lot of factors at play, just so people don't go out and try Instacart and don't make that much money and then blame me.
Yeah.
But we are hearing good things from Instacart, and but on the converse side, right? Like there was an Instacart strike last week, so obviously some workers feel that they're not being paid enough, and that Instacart, the company, isn't doing, isn't providing as many protections. So Instacart's one option. That's grocery delivery, and then on the food delivery side, there's sort of all the top companies: Postmates, DoorDash, Grubhub, Caviar, etc., Uber Eats, and we do recommend drivers sign up for those. I think the thing that I've been talking to a lot of drivers about is the thing I like about food delivery is that if you have to work, I think, relative to the other gig jobs, like especially Uber and Lyft and even Instacart grocery delivery, it really does minimize your chances, I think, of your sort of your risk of exposing yourself or exposing to someone else. And kind of an ideal scenario in food delivery, you walk into a restaurant, the food's sitting there on the counter, you grab it and go, and you don't even have to talk to anyone. All of the food delivery apps are now enabling contactless delivery. So you can actually just leave the food at the doorstep of the customer. So you don't even have to see them or talk to them. So I think that in that respect, if someone does need to work and is, kind of concerned with the potential, sort of outbreak side of things, and that's a good reason. But the only challenge we've seen on the food delivery is I think we're seeing incremental, increased demand. Uber Eats announced that they saw 10% increase in orders, so it's sort of more like that 10, 20, 30%, whereas Instacart is seeing, like 270%, right? Increase in demand. And so the food delivery apps aren't, like bustling with activity, but it's definitely an option. And, the last point I would make is that I do think it's very important for drivers to, and this is something I think always applies and just is generally good for gig workers and kind of in life in general, is to apply for these services before you need them. Postmates, DoorDash, and some of these bigger delivery services are actually now starting to limit the applications of new drivers because they have a flood of people switching over from Uber and Lyft just generally, right? There were 2.5 million unemployment claims last week. So a lot of people need to make money right now. And so they're attracted to these gig jobs like food delivery. So that's why we always tell drivers that, of course, if you're driving for Uber, you also want to have Lyft. And even grab a food delivery service just as a backup, because you never really know. And I think this is kind of a perfect situation where if a driver comes to me and all of the top food delivery services in their city are no longer taking applications, they're sort of in a hard spot. And I think that's why it's so important to prepare. So if you're in a place that you still can apply, do it now, even if you think you may not need it, because if it's the difference between making $0 and some money, I think a lot of people would prefer the latter.
Yeah, definitely always a good idea to have a backup plan. So have you, from the drivers that you have spoken to that are working with these food and grocery delivery services, have they let you know that they are seeing increased tips during these, times with coronavirus?
Yeah, I've heard mixed results on the tipping side of things. I think that, if you sort of hit social media, you see, everything from people saying, hey, I'm tipping $100 on these orders now, to people, on pizza delivery saying, like, since now that you don't see the courier, some couriers are saying, I'm not getting any tips, right? Because there's no kind of like physical accountability anymore. But I think in general, it does seem like tips are up across the board. And I think that that's sort of, again, I think we're seeing, some of the positive contributions of, just society, consumers in general, that it's like, hey, like I know for me, I normally probably tip on food. I do a lot of food delivery because I've got a kid at home, a lot of free credit, and it's sort of my job to try out these services. So I do a lot of food delivery or receive a lot of food delivery. And, I normally try to tip around 10 to 15%, and maybe 20% if they do a really great job. And during this time, I've just tried to bump it up now. 15% sort of my minimum, or 20% usually, and then maybe even up to 25% within reason. I haven't done any crazy tips like $100 yet, but I think just leaving solid tips for people, since I'm not willing, or maybe I don't have the time, or I'm scared to go out and get food myself, but there are people who are willing to do, and cash is kind of the one of the best ways to say thanks. So I think that is a positive thing that we are seeing for couriers right now.
Gotcha.
Nice. So to shift gears, and while we're still talking about cash is the most greatly appreciated thing right now, there's the Paycheck relief program, and recently came out that drivers now do have the option to qualify for this Paycheck relief program. What advice do you have for drivers who are trying to qualify for that loan assistance, and say they don't qualify? What other options are out there for them?
Yeah. So one of the confusing things right now is that there are about 6 different ways you can get paid as an Uber or Lyft driver or gig worker right now. And, I would say the number one is the sick pay. So if you do get sick, you can, kind of get payments from the companies directly. We talked and touched about that. And then there's also the CARES Act, which passed as part of the stimulus bill. And I guess just generally everyone in the US is going to receive, $1,200 if they filed taxes in 2018 or 2019, and drivers do qualify for that. And then there's the unemployment insurance, which is kind of extending unemployment insurance benefits to gig workers, so they'll get sort of whatever their state pays in unemployment insurance plus an extra $600 per week. And then you start to get into some of these more, I guess I would say, convoluted or lesser known programs. So I think it's the PPP, right? The Paycheck Protection Program is one. So there's a couple big ones that we've been looking at. And there's one that's actually the PPP, I believe, is the loan, and drivers can go out and apply for this. And then there's another one called the EIDL, and that's the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. And the interesting thing about that one is that it can be up to it's a $10,000 loan that can be turned into a grant. And so that's something that can actually be money in your pocket. So and I'm going to have to say, forgive me, anyone who's listening, if I made a mistake with some of these acronyms. I bet that I did, but there is a lot going on. And so, you kind of imagine, right, if I can't even keep it straight and I'm like looking at it every day, multiple hours a day, it's tough for the average user, the average gig worker to navigate. And that's sort of what we're trying to help with. We've actually been releasing like YouTube videos almost every single day. I've been going live once a week on YouTube. So if people do want to get the most up-to-date, if drivers do want to get the most up-to-date information, head over to the YouTube channel at the Rideshare Guy might be a good option. But I don't know that there's a great reason for a driver to go and get a loan. I mean, I guess it could sort of hold you over in a few situations, but you will have to pay that loan back. I think that if you are going to apply for one of those lesser known, some small business owners have applied for that Paycheck Protection Program, because if you have payroll, the loan converts into a grant. But most drivers, basically almost all drivers and gig workers, that probably won't be relevant to them unless they have some sort of other side business. But the EIDL program is interesting because that's potentially a grant. You do have to have an EIN to apply for that, but it's very easy to go to the IRS website, apply for an EIN. It's free. And then once you have that EIN, you can apply online for the EIDL loan, which turns into a $10,000 grant. So that's even something I applied for. And I think we have an article and video that we're working on right now that drivers will be able to take a look at that. So I think I covered all of the different, sort of options or opportunities right now for gig workers.
Awesome. And we'll try and link that, that link to the EIDL as well in the description below.
Cool.
So go ahead and click that if you guys are interested in learning more. So what's next for gig drivers after the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, so I think that what's next is, I don't think these services are, any of these services, I don't think any of these services are going away anytime soon, especially if you look at something like Uber and Lyft. We're obviously seeing a huge decrease in demand right now, but I think that there are going to be a number of changes in honestly many different areas. I think if you look to China right now with food delivery, food delivery has sort of exploded there. And now basically anyone who comes in contact with your food is being temperature checked, right? Or even tested to make sure that anyone who contacts your food, sort of does it safely and isn't sick. And so I think that we may start to see some changes in that respect, whether it's on food delivery, because one of the challenges that a lot of these gig companies face is that since they hire all independent contractors, they don't have a lot of control over their workers. So you could kind of imagine if a food delivery company had 100 employees, they all came into the warehouse in the mornings to pick up their, shifts and their cars. Everyone could be temperature checked there. Everyone could be tested, and then they go out to their respective places, right? But when you have an army of, millions of gig workers, they're sort of out there on their own, and that lack of control actually causes a lot of potential issues in situations like this, right? How do you pass out disinfectant? How do you temperature check? How do you make sure that everyone's wearing gloves, right? So how do you make sure that everyone's doing the right things? And so I think it'll be really interesting to see how that is kind of navigated in the future. And then I think when it comes to Uber and Lyft too, I think as things start to get better, they're going to experience, similar issues because of that lack of control. But I think it also just, like I said, I don't think these services are going to go away, but I think it could really make people rethink, do I want to hop into a rideshare right now, right? I alluded earlier that the fact that, when you get into a car, you're obviously less than 6 feet. You have no idea, has this driver been disinfecting? Are they sick? Are they not sick? And, frankly, I think it's a pretty unsafe place to be right now,
Right.
in the back of an Uber or Lyft car. And so if things, slowly start getting back to normal, it may be, a long time before things are 100% back to normal. So in that intermediary, I think it'll be really interesting to see, maybe a lot of passengers decide that, hey, I'm, this is not a good idea for me to, go back to rideshare. So, like I said, you could have, I think the volume will definitely go back up, but maybe it takes, years to get back to the kind of pre-coronavirus levels for Uber and Lyft.
Yeah, I think it's brought to light a lot of
Gotcha.
kind of looming concerns passengers have already had, and this has actually just given the passengers an amplified worry of those fears of, is the car clean, is the driver, taking care of the vehicle and whatnot.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think it also brings to light some of the sort of macro issues we've seen in the rideshare industry at
mm,
whole for the past few years. Obviously, kind of before coronavirus, a big topic in the news and related to gig workers was AB5 and, California classifying drivers as employees and all of the gig worker companies basically saying no way to that and kind of doing everything they can to fight that. And now, you have sort of a very interesting situation where the CEO of Uber, before the CARES Act was passed, wrote a letter to President Trump basically asking for gig workers to be included as part of unemployment. And I think that raised a lot of people's eyebrows saying, hey, if Uber is a company that has $8 billion in cash and Lyft has $2 billion in cash, should the federal government really be responsible for bailing out these workers? Shouldn't it be Uber and Lyft? And so, I think if drivers were employees, then they would be paying, both sides would be paying into unemployment insurance and the government wouldn't have to bail out. And, I'm sort of not saying one is better than the other, but I am saying that it's sort of making people question the fact
mhm,
that this is like kind of one of the downsides. And I think what we're seeing not only with rideshare, but just in general, in kind of the macro business level is the businesses that sort of, were operating on very thin margins, or the businesses that maybe had, what some might call shady labor practices, or, sort of like cutting corners here and there. Now, in this sort of time of pandemic, like some of those issues are being brought to light. The fact that, the government might have to spend millions, I don't know, maybe billions of dollars bailing out Uber and Lyft drivers, is that a good thing? And I think we haven't really seen the conversation shift to that yet, because I think right now
mhm,
people are sort of just focused on like, how do we help people, which I think is a good thing, right? It's like, all right, these Uber
Yep.
and Lyft drivers and gig workers are struggling. Let's not like, go after Uber and Lyft right now, or, bring those, how do we help the drivers? How do we get them money in their pocket right now so they can pay rent, so they can pay their bills? But in 2, 3, 4, 6 months, or even a year, I think that's when people are really going to start asking, like, hey, was that such a good idea? And I think it may even make drivers rethink this too, because we've done an annual survey every year for the past 5 years, and every year, I would say 60 to 70% of drivers say that they want to remain independent contractors, right? For all of the things that people like to complain about Uber and Lyft, most people would rather have the independent contractor set up than the employee setup. And I think that makes sense because of the nature of the gig. But I wonder if in a year when we do that survey, if a lot of people's minds will have changed, and if they say, hey, if I would have been an employee, I would have gotten sick pay. A lot of the things that drivers are complaining about right now, I would have gotten that sick pay. I would have gotten unemployment benefits. I would have gotten, if I got laid off, by Uber and Lyft, I would have gotten some, what do you call it, or furlough pay, or, kind of, additional pay basically. Right. So I do think that I'll be, I don't know for sure, but I'll be very curious to kind of watch that in the future.
Yep. So you kind of touched on it already, but like, what do you think are some of the long-term impacts for drivers and for, I guess, for Uber and Lyft as a whole with, the AB5 bill?
Yeah, well, I think that what you have to understand is that when Uber and Lyft don't want to do something, they don't do it. And they'll sort of fight like hell to explore every option and, an opportunity that they can to not do something. And if you look at California right now and kind of pre-coronavirus with AB5, Uber was directly actually making changes to the actual driver app, right? They were now showing all drivers in California where passengers are going before they accept a trip, which was a feature, drivers have long been requesting, but Uber and Lyft never, gave into. And so that's sort of one of their, that's kind of like their plan A, you would say. Maybe they're like, all right, let's change the app so that it actually seems more like we're a marketplace and, actually connecting independent contractors. And so they're making a number of changes there. The companies Uber, Lyft, Postmates, I think even Instacart and a couple others have contributed to this ballot initiative, which gathered enough signatures already to be on the November 2020 ballot, I guess, if that election happens or however it might happen. that a ballot initiative will be on the ballot, and it's sort of a compromise that would give drivers a quasi minimum wage and certain benefits and maybe even a little bargaining, but it doesn't go so far as making all drivers employees. So you can sort of, and then of course Uber and Lyft and these companies are also challenging AB5 just from, you know, the lawsuit perspective, right? And so you can sort of see that, like, I think when you kind of have to almost have like a backup plan, right? If I'm a legislator and I'm pro, you know, I'm looking to pass AB5, and you really understand that Uber and Lyft like are not the types of companies, and probably Uber specifically, they're not the type of company that's going to just say, okay, we lost, we'll succumb, you know, we'll give in, we'll do it. You sort of have to have that backup plan for enforcement. And I think that's kind of what I've brought or tried to bring to light in a lot of these discussions. Hey, if this turns out to be a 10-year prolonged legal battle, that is what it is, but like, what do we do for drivers in the meantime? You know, I'm much more, you know, if people asked me in the past if I was a supporter of AB5, yes or no, I would say no. Like a lot of things in life, you know, it's a complex answer. There's a lot of caveats to that, but my short answer is no, because I think that there are other opportunities to address that all drivers care about. You know, not all drivers are ever going to agree on employee versus independent contractor, but I think pretty much every driver is going to agree on getting paid more, reducing Uber and Lyft's commission, you know, figuring out a better way to deal with unfair deactivations, right? And so there are certain things that, you know, I would say maybe not 100%, but like 90 to 99% of drivers do care about. And those are, you know, the things I would rather see legislation kind of work towards, the things that, you know, all drivers could support. Because there are, you know, in my opinion, a lot of low-hanging fruits there still.
Yeah. And while we're still talking about rideshare and legislation, before we move into you know, kind of more macro mobility, micro mobility stuff, I'm going to read this because I want to make sure I get it right. So we had Blair Schlechter on our show a couple weeks ago, and you and him just recently published a research paper called Congestion at the Curb, which is analysis of ride hailing at LAX and recommendations to optimize the TNC system at airports. Can you give our listeners a little summary of what you discovered, and how can airports improve there, and what can rideshare drivers do to help improve that?
Yeah, definitely. So that was a fun project, and you did accurately note the long title. And I think in any white paper or report, you sort of have to have that's like the first test. You have to have a nice long title in order to get any type of credibility. So we passed the first test on the first page. But once you dig into the report, I mean, really the impetus for this report was, one of the things that I'm very passionate about is just providing that worker perspective. And I think providing that worker perspective in the confines of everything else that's going on, right? So if you look at any situation, especially like with regulation or Uber and Lyft, I think in the past, you know, Uber and Lyft's relationship with drivers has always been kind of one-sided. It's sort of been, hey, Uber and Lyft do their thing and drivers just have to go along with it. And I think with regulation, unfortunately, we've seen similar things happen where, you know, this conversation might be about how do we regulate congestion, or how do we regulate Uber and Lyft more broadly, the number of drivers. And a lot of times I see these reports, this research happening, and they aren't talking to any drivers. So I think for me, what I'm trying to do is really bridge the gap between, you know, like in this specific case, you know, like Uber and Lyft and airports are working closely on this complete revamp that happened at LAX. And so that's really what we look to study. It's how do drivers fit into this piece, and kind of not necessarily taking, I mean, I guess if I'm taking someone's side, it's sort of taking the driver's side, but really kind of like understanding each constituent and including that driver's viewpoint. So, you know, you have passengers, you have drivers, you have airport authorities, and you have the TNCs. And so that's really what the report aimed to examine. We went out and did sort of stakeholder interviews with all of these companies, airport teams, Uber, Lyft, and sort of just understood what they were trying to achieve. And of course, you know, I think where I'm trying to provide a unique viewpoint is from that driver's point of view. And, you know, kind of an interesting example that we noted in that report was there was a situation where the airport authorities saw that there were no cars basically available in the LA exit lot. So there were passengers waiting there and there were no cars. They look over at the staging lot where all of the Uber and Lyft drivers are supposed to be waiting, and they saw a bunch of cars there. And so they thought to themselves, okay, why are there no Uber cars available right now if there's a bunch sitting in the staging lot? And the reason why that stood out to me was because as a driver, a lot of drivers know that you can go onto the Uber or Lyft driver apps and actually see the queue, how many cars are in front of you in the driver app. And the airport teams didn't even have that basic information, right? Like, I feel like if I was there on site during that situation, I could have easily diagnosed, like, okay, actually, all of these drivers, even though there's drivers in Uber and Lyft lot, they're all online with Lyft right now because Lyft is offering, a better bonus or whatever it might be. And you can see that on the Uber queue, it's 0 to 10 cars, which is kind of rare, but you can kind of imagine, you can kind of then make inferences from there. And so if you're an airport authority, you go to Uber and say, hey, we need to do a better job of, sort of incentivizing drivers to come here during these times, or, hey, look, there's this issue that we uncovered, right? And so it's sort of just using that driver perspective to kind of make things run more smoothly, to work more smoothly, and, kind of incorporate everyone's viewpoints. So that was really kind of the goal of the report. And I think that we did that successfully. So looking at more topics to do in the future, and that sort of falls under the consulting side of the business where we work with. That was sort of the first policy report that we put out there, but I think we'll definitely be doing more in the future. I'm doing some work with cities as a sub-consultant on a couple projects. And then in the past, we've worked with a lot of startups and companies, but we're sort of just seeing, how we can kind of help with that, the government and policy side of the conversation too.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. So how do you see, I guess to kind of back up and go back into some newer like mobility services, and how do you see shared mobility evolving over the next few years, and how essential is that going to be to reducing congestion and making transportation more efficient, especially in those larger metropolitan areas?
Well, I think one of the issues that we're sort of seeing generally with Uber and Lyft and rideshare is that too much of a good thing can be bad. And I think kind of pre-coronavirus, I called the 2020, I was calling the year of regulation for rideshare, and now it may be the year of coronavirus. But before that all happened, I think that we're really seeing a large trend, which will pick up again in the future politically. The political will that Uber and capital that Uber and Lyft once had, where they could kind of do whatever they want, whenever they want, wherever they want, is now gone. And cities are really starting to look at a few key things. I think they're looking at the labor component. So this would be like in New York City, where they've instituted a quasi minimum pay floor. Minimum wage. It's kind of a quasi minimum wage, more of a minimum pay. And then in California with AB5, sort of telling these companies they need to classify their drivers as employees. And then there's also the congestion aspect. When you go out and you see 50,000 Uber and Lyft vehicles in a city like Los Angeles, you start to think to yourself, like, man, these guys are everywhere. They're
Right.
causing traffic is going up. And
Yeah.
if you actually look at the numbers, they're actually, Uber and Lyft are single digit contributors to the overall traffic in, cities across the country. But I think they are an easy scapegoat. So, to Uber and Lyft's credit, I don't think the numbers show they're not causing that much traffic on an overall basis, but they are an easy scapegoat. And so I think that it's important for cities to, cities are looking at this, and they're also looking at the fees. This would be like things like airport fees, but also just the per trip fees and taxes that they charge Uber and Lyft, since, these companies are operating on public grounds and using public resources. So I think that's the big thing we're seeing there, and kind of how cities are looking to regulate these companies. Not only is it happening with rideshare, but it's also happening with micromobility. So that'd be e-scooters and e-bikes. And there's a lot of debate right now, especially on the data side of things, with micromobility. And one of the things that I like to do is really study related industries of mobility, right? So if I'm an expert in rideshare, and that's sort of what I do, micromobility, for example, is not something I look at every day, but I do think you can kind of spot and identify trends. Like right now in micromobility, there's a big data battle brewing. Actually, Uber is in a huge lawsuit with the city of LA over new data reporting requirements. And I think that could, easily pop over to rideshare in the future. There's only a few cities in the US that cities actually have good rideshare data on, but they all are starting to get it for scooters and bikes. And so it's sort of only a matter of time before, once they nail all that down, they kind of start asking for rideshare data too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And with cities, are we going to see, it's inevitable, but are we going to see cities continue to adjust to building more infrastructure and more regulation to support shared and micromobility, or do you see that more gearing towards, potentially lessening the prevalence of micromobility?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that I've always been pretty bearish on rideshare in their capacity to improve city life, congestion, et cetera, right? Like, I think that in general, it's great having Uber and Lyft in a city for, kind of access to transportation options, but it isn't going to, it's only going to make congestion worse, right? And that's kind of what we're seeing, for example, with all of the studies that are now coming out. But with micromobility, and like I've firsthand gone out and kind of from my Uber and Lyft experience seen how many people are taking these short little trips, right, that are sort of often much better served in a different type of vehicle, different form factor. And also just the fact that when you take a micromobility ride, whether it's a scooter or a bike, it's basically cheaper, faster, more convenient, and more fun than an Uber or Lyft for anything in 0 to 1 miles in good weather, right? And so you can sort of see that there's a lot more kind of positive I guess potential benefit to cities, I think, in working with micromobility operators than there is with rideshare. Like, rideshare is a great service that can kind of exist and do its thing on its own and will need some regulation, but it isn't going to do anything to get cars off the road. I mean, it's literally adding more cars to the road. People hate sharing rides. Drivers hate sharing rides. Customers hate sharing rides. Like, everybody hates it, right? And so that's where I think the kind of interesting dynamic is. And one thing that I've been a little, kind of bummed out about is just the fact that, when rideshare came around, cities kind of got blindsided by Uber and Lyft. And, now, when micromobility popped up, they're like, all right, let's not let this happen again. But it's actually something that I think could really benefit cities. And right now, in the time of coronavirus, we're seeing this play out in real life. A lot of cities are reducing public transportation. The city of San Francisco had a bunch of muni operators come down with coronavirus, unfortunately. And so they shut down 70 muni lines. And here I am thinking to myself, okay, public transit, is kind of dicey. Rideshare is kind of dicey. What's a great vehicle for anything 0 to 1 or 0 to 2 miles in the time of coronavirus? How about an e-bike? How about an e-scooter? You're literally in open air, riding around. You can easily strap gloves on and never touch anything. You know what I mean? So it's sort of like, that's just, kind of like a small example. But, I think that maybe it wasn't the best timing and that these operators were still getting started, and cities have been heavily regulating. So now I don't want to completely put the blame on cities, but it is going to be a challenge to now I just think that there's a lot of opportunity for cities to work with micro and kind of embrace micro mobility operators, and I feel like they're taking a much more kind of butting heads approach than they should or could be.
Yeah, well, and I think part of the issue is I think micromobility hit the scene much, much faster than ride sharing did. It seems like overnight you went from seeing like one or two bird scooters out on the road to seeing 50 on every single
Yeah.
corner. And that I think that massive flood was a bit shocking, and that caused cities like Beverly Hills or Santa Monica
Yeah.
to say, hey, you know what, we actually don't want these in our city. We're just going to ban them completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think obviously in general, right, change is hard, right? I mean, like I don't really use Facebook anymore, but when I used to use Facebook, and anytime they would update the news feed, right, people would all freak out and say, "Oh my
Yep.
God, I liked it the old way," and then a year later, everyone forgets about it, and it's like totally
Exactly.
fine.
Yeah.
But and I think with scooters that you did point out, Nate, that that was definitely one of the things we saw early on is that they're visible,
Hmm.
unlike an Uber or a Lyft, that has a small trade dress and kind of looks like any car. You don't really realize Uber and Lyft until there's 50,000 in your city.
Right.
And now you sort of understand that, okay, maybe too many, but 10, 20, 30,000 is not that noticeable in a sea of millions of cars in a city like
Yeah.
Los Angeles. But with scooters, they are very jarring to the eye. And I think that it's just sort
Hmm.
of a good example of something that I see a lot of the discussion around, oh, what if a scooter is in the sidewalk, or if they're blocking this and that? And there's definitely some smart regulation that you can do. But I mean, at the same time, like, what do we do about a scooter on the sidewalk? Why don't we ask people to just pick it up? Right. Like, I think for me, I'm looking for, very simple, like, obviously there's some downsides, but how hard is it to fix some of the negative externalities? I think very simple. How hard is it to paint a few lines on the sidewalk and ask people to
Mhm.
park their scooters there, to tell the companies to give riders a 50-cent discount if they drop them off there? Right, there's some very easy technological solutions that you can implement within the confines of the products and the systems that like, it's not a big ask. Like, those 3 or 4 things I just mentioned are very easy to do, and it's not like you're asking Bird or Lime to like go spend a ton of engineering resources, right? And so if you don't understand the products and the consumers and kind of how these services are working, it's very hard to regulate them in an effective way, so that then when you do have a situation like this where they can provide a lot of value, it's sort of like, you're not able to take advantage of that. And I think it's just kind of, it's tough, but you do have to kind of be able to understand these products, these services, these viewpoints. You can kind of identify what are the best use cases where they can help cities or help with partnerships, or kind of I think how I've been putting it lately is that there's positives and negatives with any of these models. So, like, how do you extract the positives and find a way to work with the best positives? Because I think that's what we're seeing with rideshare. There's a ton of positives about Uber and Lyft. Like, I personally picked up people at 2 a.m. who are waiting for a bus and that never came and had to get home, to see their family or to like their next job at 4 or 5 a.m. Right. And so in that case, like,
Mhm.
Uber and Lyft are amazing service, right? Like, made me feel so good as a driver to do that trip. And so how do you sort of like capture, understand those positives, capture them, and kind of expand on them?
Yeah, yeah, and I think if cities can manage, like a city bike and even just having bike racks across the city, I think taking that similar approach to scooters is such an easy win for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that what's challenging is that, kind of going back to, what you guys mentioned, Reese, the change, right? People don't like change, anything that's new, and
Mhm.
especially with scooters. But I mean, frankly, like, sometimes I think regulators, and I'm sort of saying this as someone who's not a politician, so it's probably a lot easier than it sounds, but you kind of have to
Right.
make, like, it's sort of your job, as a regulator or politician, to often make, or sometimes make, tough choices that aren't necessarily going to be received well in the short term, but will pan out in the long term. I think
Mhm.
congestion, decongestion pricing is a good example of that, where, London and New York, like the cities that have looked at decongestion pricing, initially people hate it because now they have to pay for something that they're used to getting for free. And then 6 months later, I think there was something like Finland or somewhere else did this too, and they did it as a pilot. And so when it came back to regular pricing, everyone was like, "Hey, what the hell? We want to keep this, decongestion
Yeah, yeah.
pricing." So it's sort of like, I think scooters and micromobility are another good example of where there's just so many potential positive externalities, like connecting the first and last mile, like actually eliminating trips off of the street, like car trips off of the street for anything 0 to 1 or even 0 to 2 miles. And, sort of my fear is that those, we may never see some of those benefits, right? Because either the companies get regulated so hard, or even like, I think right now, one of the things I've seen floated, the idea of in coronavirus, right? If there was some, this is actually like, micromobility could actually be a service that's subsidized, right, by the government. If they're
Mhm.
cutting 70 bus lines, like, take some of that money and redirect it to e-bikes, for example, in San Francisco. And now users, they have to pay $1 to unlock it, but then the ride is free if you're an essential worker or something like
Mm.
that, right? And so I think that that's sort of what, it's tough because I don't think we're seeing a ton of that type of innovation, but I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for it.
Mhm.
Yep. With rideshare definitely contributing to congestion in some areas across the U.S. How do you see it fitting into transportation? 5 to 10 years from now, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it really shifting a whole lot?
Well, I would say that, sort of left to its own devices, it'll probably kind of slowly creep up and keep increasing, the kind of percentage contribution to congestion. But I do think that excuse me, basically every major city around the world, I think, is facing increasing congestion problems, right? And so if you're a regulator, the reality is that Uber and Lyft are an easy scapegoat, even though in, a city like LA, they might be like 8 or 7% of overall traffic. It's easy to say like, hey, let's, let's limit the number of Uber and Lyft cars. And that'll take a year or two to study and figure out and implement. And, by that time I'll be at some better position, right? within the government. And I won't have to worry about this because it is a really tough issue, not to take any credit away. And so I think that might be what we'll see, is that cities look to sort of limit kind of the operations of Uber and Lyft. And like, frankly, I don't think that's going to do much, right? And that's sort of also what I mentioned in the report we did on, at LAX, right? Like you can kind of identify and single out Uber and Lyft and move them away from the curb. And that may help certain things in the short term. But ultimately, right, if you sort of make it so inconvenient that people start returning to, like getting a friend or family member to drop them off instead of taking Uber and Lyft, because those cars can come into the terminal, that's probably what's going to happen. And, it's still a little early to say if that's going to happen at LAX, but I think that's definitely a big risk. And like, if that ended up happening, it would not surprise me. So sort of similarly with Uber and Lyft, right? There's a reason why, customers are adopting, and there's 50,000 cars. It's because they love the service. It's more convenient or cheaper than driving themselves, or whatever the reasons might be. But as time goes on, those reasons aren't going to change. So if they can't take Uber and Lyft, they're going to go for some other alternative method. And it just never addresses the root cause. And so I think that's kind of what we're going to need to see is, for example, and this is why I think that if you kind of really understand how these rideshare services are working, there's so much opportunity as a regulator, right? If let's say you're a city that is like very green, and sort of cares about the environment, for example, like Uber and Lyft have a fleet of vehicles, they work with partners like HyreCar, right? So you could kind of imagine that, hey, if you start off and say, hey, by next year, 1% of your vehicles need to be electric vehicles, and we're going to subsidize part of that or get money from here, or that's just what it costs to operate in our city, and you could take it or leave it. Like, I think 1% of Uber and Lyft's fleet to be electric by next year, I don't think most people would disagree with that. Like, that sounds like a pretty good thing to me. It sounds reasonable, right? And maybe it's like 2%, and kind of slowly increases. So if you're a city that really cares about, the kind of negative impact of, kind of like gas vehicles, or maybe a certain percent has to be fleet hybrid vehicles, right? You can sort of start addressing that with a company like Uber and Lyft. Like, it's going to be very hard to say like, hey, there's 10 million people in LA, 1% of you need to drive an electric vehicle versus going to Uber and Lyft. And then, then you can start like, the people who are doing 40, 50 hours a week, Uber and Lyft can identify them or work with partners to identify them, or have fleet partners, that get a special deal if, they go and say, okay, we need more electric vehicles, right? So that, like, you kind of, there's a lot of opportunity, I would say, to improve some of these things. And like, I'm hopeful for it, but, I'm not seeing much action on some of these fronts. It's more, I think the regulations tend to be more like, let's limit the number of cars versus, sort of like, how do we make it more of a win-win-win for everyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Harry, so much information. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to leave the listeners with?
No, I think that's good. I appreciate you guys having me on. Definitely, we're releasing a ton of content, especially on YouTube. I would say right now is a great spot if you sort of want to stay up to date with all the latest and greatest when it comes to unemployment, coronavirus, opportunities for gig workers, whether that's in delivery or, like you mentioned, Nate, we're covering a lot of other odd jobs, just basically anything that can put money in workers' pockets. You can check us over out on, you can go to therideshareguy.com/YouTube. We also have a podcast. We've got a couple podcasts for drivers. One that I host that's called the Rideshare Guy, that's more of an industry level view at rideshare and mobility. And then one that Jay, my senior contributor, he's got over 27,000 Uber and Lyft trips, and that really gets into the nitty gritty life of being an Uber and Lyft driver or gig worker. So, and that's called the Rideshare Dojo. So lots of options to stay up to date on all the latest and greatest.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Thanks,
everybody.
Harry.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks for joining us on another home edition of Mobility Revolution. And tune in